The criminal censorship of the national news companies, which would have been owned by David Bowles, was criminally obstructed by the war warrants by the Confederates in the overthrow of the United States, at which point all Confederates were drafted as militia, at which point the qualifier of militia infiltrates into the function of them generating their wizard clans, known as the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, at which point the active engagement of hate crimes such as social engineering by the use of militia force, by the intimidation through the threats of violence and the application of violence, engages in active subversions of the general public. You have your target who is criminally assaulted or threatened, and the select group specifically designed to be intimidated as a direct reaction of having direct knowledge of the criminal activities are designed to get them to settle into place against their interest as a free, liberty-based people, at which point the coerced people are no longer a liberty-based people. They are no longer a free society. They are no longer a rule of law society. They are subject as slaves, having accepted their place due to the violence and intimidation where they have subjugated themselves to the criminal manipulation against their self-determination as a collective society, qualifying a hyper-violent minority, a unsatisfiable violent spitting mob, qualifies the overthrow of the popular will, at which point you have the application through the unruly minority to overthrow the will of the majority, at which point you no longer have a republic, you have a Confederate terrorist organization conducted by wizard insurrection. No, wizard insurrection is the use of secrets and the protection of secrets, and these protections of secrets qualifies the position that they will actively prosecute anyone who has proof or evidence of the criminal activity, which they want to bar from remedy in the general public, at which point the activity is the special units of the secret permits qualifying the criminal activities for the KKK terrorism allows for the alterations due to the specialized secret science and equipment from that science used by the government, permitting for the function of the terrorism in question against the popular will to overthrow the civilian government. Now, with this in mind, you have the objective understanding that the censorship is the reduction exponentially of the reporting of the news, at which point you have the crafting of anything that's represented was pre-certified by the insurrectionists using the coercion in question, at which point the manipulation of the downgraded version is the thing that they would view as acceptable as to limit the effectiveness of American propaganda, qualifying the maximized effect of the Confederate propaganda. Now, with this in mind, the act of censorship qualified is essential to understand that the war in Ukraine is based upon the war on David. Their understanding that David's insurance, which is qualified to the military grade study on how to survive a zombie apocalypse, is the base insurance amongst other insurance, such as the insurance of work replacement and free days and work auxiliaries, which would be supplemented, as well as the function of the financial bond of the equivalent value. So you have the products, you have the product's value in the insurance, you have the product's value in the insurance, and you have the double value of the product of insurance on the basis of work, auxiliary, financial bonds, and the zombie insurance, at which point all products traded on the network would certify the necessary cost of business in order to proceed under the mechanism of the free economy without the Confederate communism fundamentally altering against and in retaliation for hatred of God and God's market, which he has expressly written into everyone in order to engage in the free negotiation for settlements, which is the active evolving of the persistent realities and necessities of each person and their needs, to their base wants, to their more luxurious wants, to their more complicated pursuits, qualifying the freedom of the pursuit of happiness, at which point you have the religion of the Confederates loyal to the Satanists, seeking the absolute destruction of God and those who would follow God under the pursuit of the development of liberty and freedom. Now, liberty, by its originalist position, the actual original definition, would have to be self-determination without coercion, at which point the application of other people's moralities being able to be legislated against you would be a clear violation of this, under the specific understanding that the violation is under the superior entity, which is the function of religion, providing punishments and rewards based upon that religion's morality, implemented by an unruly, unsatisfying, spitting, snot-nosed terrorist organization known as the Ku Klux Klan and its multi-diverse functions as a Druid religion system, which actively engages in all of its various functions, including the function of them unable to engage in wizard negotiations and settlements. Thus, the function is normal because terrorists can't be negotiated with, because terrorists don't negotiate in good faith. So it is bound for their Druid religion to engage in civil wars in order to violently oppose the other. So when the Druids on the left claim that they are being physically threatened and are in danger from the Druids on the right, they're absolutely correct, but it's a nullified position because the precedent was accepted because their position is secret terrorism as a function of their insurrectionist anti-American position, at which point their acceptance of the criminal threat nullifies the legitimacy of their complaint, at which point fundamentally you have to understand that these zombie insurance protections would have been sold to the Russians based upon the several layers of court-protected schedules for David and the rest of the network, at which point each layer being finished is traded upon, trading on to the next layer, which is actively traded on and refined and traded to the next layer, and so on, qualifying the additional resources necessary to have engaged in the insurance sold to the Soviet Union in preparation for its collapse. Now, the Soviet Union, having been negotiated against its collapse, would have done so under the understanding that David Bowles was going to become king of a new country, according to the court records, which were supposed to be protected by the American judges who were subverted by the Confederate terrorists, who are actively protecting the criminal market. Now, this overthrow of justice has actively barred these positions because David would have stabilized the Russians and would have promoted them, giving them a better international presence, qualifying the position that the use of threats against Russia, secretly or openly, would have been retaliated against with negative behavior because of the position that they would have been in the public goodwill, under their public acknowledgments from the promotions from trading under David's network internationally, under the treaty that they expected to happen on maturity. Qualifying this, the Russians have better PR and the Russians have better resources. The qualifier of them being rich and benign, they're stable and unwilling to engage in irrational actions such as wars, engages in the position that the insurance from David had to be obstructed in order for the Confederates to engage in the proxy war against the Russians. Now, the Confederates engaging in the proxy war against the Russians specifically targeted David Bowles and many others who are fundamental to the stability of the international community and their legal engagement of international law. At which point, the systematic genocide of David Bowles and his society qualifies the complete eradication of the vast majority of what should have been protected contracts in order to substantially change capitalism into the Confederate will under the dictates of the irrational criminal violence, at which point you have the persistent pursuit of their larger plans, which qualifies their other broader genocides. Now, let's see. War is a racket, and everyone should know that the racist Confederates most definitely show, at which point the expression of them engaging as a virus, fundamentally engaging in the slow manipulation and changing of their host, which they have barred from retaliating against its criminal activities, certifies the strategy of the insurgency, which has a permanent protection on all of its criminal actions, at which point it could play the long game when losing ground to the Americans, such as when it lost the original Civil War and continued to engage in its insurrectionist behavior by its KKK evolution. Now, that engagement specifically tells you everything you need to know about who these creeps are, at which point the claim that it's inappropriate to assume bad faith on their behalf because they're playing the long game is irrelevant because they are playing the long game, at which point their position of the originalists is not the originalist of the American definition, it's the original Confederate definition, and the original Confederate definition forces the system to go back into its original Confederate roots, qualifying the engagement of this systematic open racism, qualifying the active abuse of those that they have targeted who have been subjugated by the use of criminal war against civilians in order to engage in the civilian slavery population, and thus those who were born of a weaker ilk versus those who are born of a no more noble, violent nature, shall inherently engage in the plantation slavery function, qualifying the systematic destruction of general technology in order to reduce the advantage of technology. They will go back to whipping all who have been captured to the function as a slave population, at which point the purification of their bloods includes the system of eradicating the political identities which they have viewed favorably as long as they had been useful, including the mixed bloods, which they have been promoting under the fraudulent expression that they are no longer acting in bad faith under the long con position. Because they have mixed blood in them, they are no longer viable members of the Confederate Society. So they have to promote them in order to engage in the larger trap, at which point they could be removed. So the position that they're currently being promoted and amplified and validating, made comfortable to go into the trap, they are systematically being set up, such as with the other cons, such as with the homosexual con, where they are engaged in the function of developing of genetic guilt on the basis of morality, on whatever that means to them, which is an irrational thing to pursue because fundamentally it's all pseudoscience used as a cover story to their criminal nature and their base wants, qualifying their activities to engage in their insurrection against David and the subordinate network, at which point you have the destruction of the United States and its allies and all else inside the world, qualifying their activities as normalized functions to secretly or publicly threaten Russia to engage in the proxy war, at which point the former Soviet Union as a collective unit is full of Slavs. The qualifier of the racism includes the Nazi-generated racism against the Slavic people as a people, at which point you have the active desire for their complete and total malicious eradication, at which point the engagement of the proxy war is designed specifically to purge the races that they do not like, at which point they're willing to fight Russia through the proxy down to the last Ukrainian, not because they are fighting Russia, but because they're killing Slavs. Now, this needs to be understood in the larger context because their position is that Slavs are slaves, and the engagement of that qualifies them as an inferior group, and that qualifier that they are fundamentally inferior and disposable requires the genetic cleansing of them from the world, at which point they're actively going to demonize whoever they can amongst their traps in order to get large populations and large populations and large populations to be dissolved, at which point the active Russians who try to escape Russia to the other countries in order to protest or whatever qualifies their being maliciously opposed, because the fundamental racist position is the destruction of the Slavs by the racist wizards, which may or may not be understood by the general public based upon how much research was allowed by the racists who were guiding them in the propaganda, qualifying the confession as to have engaged in the dark psychology, which is the least amount of good in order to engage in the most amount of evil, at which point their propaganda would promote the least amount of legitimate information to the general public in order to seed the foundations of their larger hatreds in the larger schemes for the destruction of criminal activities of the civilian populations or peoples who otherwise would have been law-abiding members of the collective communities or the international community at large. At which point you have these systems, which have to be fundamentally understood, have to be uncensored, published, and mass distributed in order to force the duel. At which point the position of everything that Vladimir Putin has said might be validated, and could easily be validated if he uncensors and publishes the records objectively understood on his part, certifying it by his government, qualifying the objective claim to the international community for court in order to force the duel between the Americans and the Confederates in the Civil War, so that he can protect his people from the credible threats against the insurrection. So the war in Ukraine is specifically and holistically the war on David. And all parties involved, if they wish to live and not be slaughtered by these satanic freaks, have to start confessing publicly with their legitimate seals and procedures in order to produce court results. This all is mandatory. If they don't do it, they're lying. They might very well be trying to scheme a scheme in order to manipulate their own ends for the subversion of the position, at which point they are not telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in order to engage in their claim to the court, at which point their attempt to defraud the court disqualifies all of their claims. So at that point, they would be lying, even if they would have otherwise been telling the truth. In order for them to engage in legitimate court functions of law and order, they have to tell the whole truth. They have to release all of the certifiable documents. They have to engage in the legitimate procedures. They have to bring it to maturity.